In Ephesians 1:2, Paul writes, "Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ." Grace in the beginning. At the end, Ephesians 6:24, he writes, "Grace be with all those who love our Lord Jesus Christ in sincerity. Amen." Grace at the end. Ephesians 2:8, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourself, it is the gift of God." Grace all the way through. Grace at the beginning, grace at the end, and grace all the way through. That is our way to look at two books today as we kind of rush through, kind of in our last session, starting with The Magician's Nephew and then ending with The Last Battle. Now, on The Magician's Nephew, Lewis struggled more with this book than all the others combined. In fact, he started right after The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe with a section called Le Fay, the Le Fay fragment, where he uses this kindly grandmother, but then she is replaced later on by a sinister godmother. And both of them call to mind the idea of Morgan Le Fay, the fairy sister of Arthur, the really evil woman, if you remember. But it starts with two children, Diggory and Polly. And who remembers who Diggory is? Who is he going to become in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Professor Kirk. So this is kind of Diggory's beginning. We're going there. And Diggory, with Polly, is kind of, his mother is dying, and he and Polly are kind of exploring the attic on a cold day. And they stumble upon Diggory's very vain, selfish, and really cruel Uncle Andrew, who is trying to become a magician. And he's trying to find a way into other worlds. And he had received some fairy dust from this witch, the sorceress, Madame Le Fay, and allusion to King Arthur's legend. Now, Uncle Andrew at first manipulates nature. He tries to kind of say, how can I exploit nature to make money or get power? And then he's going to manipulate people. He is a caricature of Robert Capron. Robert Capron was that pitiless schoolmaster at Wynard that Lewis suffered under. And this is Lewis finally getting back at his old school teacher. Those of us who write know that revenge is sweet when we put people into our books and we mock them. I have Pat Robertson in many of my books. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Okay. But then he had once seen this man as an ogre, but now he's portrayed as a buffoon. In fact, in Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis's autobiography, he says that he would make a very good villain. And he has very similar characteristics, physical characteristics to Uncle Andrew. Both of them had a sharp nose, tousled gray hair, an Assyrian smile, and a lot of malice. In fact, the harsh schoolmaster uses this term, my little man, in referring to Diggory, and that same phrase was used by Robert Capron about C.S. Lewis when he wrote his father. And so you see how Lewis took this kind of real person, this cruel headmaster, and he kind of stuck him in there. Now, Uncle Andrew likes to do experiments, particularly on animals, and he uses these kind of furry, sweet little guinea pigs. Some of them die, but others explode like little bombs. And it's the kind of amusement that teenage boys would like there. But he tricks Polly, this little girl, into trying on a yellow ring, which makes her disappear into another realm. The whole discovery that Lewis had at the end of World War II, that the Nazis had been experimenting on human beings, was still fresh in his mind. And so he's beginning to incorporate this into the Uncle Andrew there. And he has what he calls the mark of the wicked magician, which is kind of either the mark of Cain or the mark of the beast, the 666. Now, Diggory has to do the right thing and rescue Polly. So he takes a yellow ring and he puts two green rings, which bring you back to our world, in his pocket, and they end up in the woods between the world, this quiet and dreamy place. It's like sitting under Wynn's sermons. Very sleep-inducing. I'm kidding. Wynn just left. No, that was for Wynn, I know, up there. But they look, and there are all these pools that will take you to different worlds as well. And they arrive in a very dark world called Charn. Think of Charnel, where everything is in ruins. There's this kind of shadowy hall, which what seems to be like waxworks, these statues of people, noble and robed and crowned. And as they walk down the corridor, the farther they get, the faces become more proud and arrogant, stony and merciless, until they reach a woman who is so beautiful and yet so harsh-looking. And near her is this little golden bell. And beside the bell, there is a little hammer with which to hit it. But there's a little sign that warns you. Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger. Or wonder till it drives you mad what would have followed if you had. So you have this temptation for knowledge. You want knowledge. And what did Eve and Adam eat in the garden but the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil? And so he is confronted with the same temptation. Now, the two children recognize they're under some kind of enchantment, but Diggory cannot resist it. He finally gives in, picks up the little hammer, and knocks the bell. And two things happen. First, the worlds begin to crumble or implode. And the beautiful queen, taller and stronger and more menacing and fierce than they had realized, awakes, breaking from the spell, and her name is Queen Jadis. She will become the White Witch of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Jadis is a French word meaning of old. And like Milton's view of Satan, she finds it better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. She also comes from a story by H. Rider Haggard, the story of She. I don't know if any of you remember She, the story of this kind of enchantress woman, this occult beauty who tries to seek immortality through unlawful means. In one of Haggard's works, she is later called the White Witch. But it also comes from Ishtar. And Ishtar is this kind of Babylonian warrior, this goddess worshipped by the Ninevites. Notice, too, at the end, Jadis is going to climb the wall. This is an allusion to the gospel, to Jesus' words that a shepherd enters the gate, but a thief will climb over the wall. Just like in Milton, Satan leaps over the wall to get surrounding the Garden of Eden, so now Jadis climbs the wall to get there. Now, she's interested in the magic of Uncle Andrew that brought such insignificant children like Polly and Diggory to her world. And she boasts how she had this deplorable word, this powerful word that could destroy anything. And Aslan later tells the children that in their world, there's some people who discover a secret just as terrible that could destroy their world. What is this an obvious reference to in the 50s? The bomb, the atomic bomb. And he's saying, basically, you are able to kind of destroy your world too. Lewis did not trust people with such power. In fact, he wrote a great little book called The Abolition of Man, in which some people believe that they are above the law and they can use power to control and destroy others. They usually end up in Washington. Now, the children try to escape using their rings, but Queen Jadis grabs Polly's hair and jumps back with them, not only into the woods between the worlds, but back into London, where everyone marvels at her because she's a tall woman, but they think she's a mad woman, and they call her the Empress of Colney Hatch. Colney Hatch was an insane asylum. So in London, it was still there, and so Lewis is kind of basically saying to all of his fellow Londoners, this is a real crazy woman. She has a terrible fight at the lamppost, and in desperation, Diggory and Polly tried to pull her out of England, but somehow they pull in Uncle Andrew, a cabbie named Frank, married to Helen, his horse, and a lamppost into one of those pools that places them into a world of utter darkness. Now, the lamppost has come in, and where do we see the lamppost? The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first thing that basically Lucy will see. So you see that this book took so long for Lewis to write because he's trying to work everything together. And so he finally finishes after all the others and wants to make everything fit, and so how they got there. Thus begins the Genesis of Narnia, with a lot of parallels to the book of Genesis itself. It's an empty world, but Cabbie Frank says it's so quiet, but there's something happening, and what we need to do now is watch and listen, not talk. Then the shock of hearing Aslan speak is lovely and terrible. The word comes out as creative. In Genesis, how does God create? He speaks by the word. Jesus is the word made flesh. And now, here in Milton's Paradise Lost, we find that a tawny lion comes up out of the earth. And it is through song that Tolkien even has, that Narnia begins to awake. There's this symphony of song, and everything comes to life. Small little mounds, large mounds, everything, and all the animals come out. So it's Lewis's kind of very creative way to deal with evolution. Say basically there are a lot of things that come, that evolve in our world, but still what this kind of physical world needs is the breath of God. Without the breath of God, there's no creation. And so he brings those two together. Now, since Diggory brought Queen Jadis, the White Witch, into Narnia, Aslan gives him a special quest to protect the wrong that he has done to the sweet country of Narnia on its day of its birth. And you know, in most fairy tales, you start with a curse. Sleeping Beauty, there's a curse at birth. I suppose we all bring a curse into the world. I had a twin sister, Tessie. She brought me into the world, okay? Diggory is told to go to the western wild and find this great mountain and pluck an apple from the tree of life and bring it to Aslan. He suffers his grand temptation when the witch appears on the mountain with him and says, "Why don't you take a bite of the apple for yourself? Because it will make you immortal. It will heal you of whatever you need." But he resists, and he returns to Aslan and hands him the apple, and he says, "I brought you the apple you wanted, sir." And Aslan looks at him and says, "Well done, son of Adam. For this fruit you have hungered and thirsted and wept." What had happened was Diggory's mother is dying, and he knows that this apple will heal her, and so he's tempted not to bring it for himself, but to bring the apple back to heal his mother. This is maybe Lewis's struggle too, because when his mother was dying, he was the same age as Diggory, and he prayed to God, and yet God did not seem to answer his prayers. And Aslan then begins to explain what would happen if he had stolen the apple to heal. He says, your mother would have been healed. There's no doubt about it. This kind of law always works. This magic works. But what would have happened? The implications would have been worse than you could have imagined. And so Lewis is wrestling with his own kind of guilt and sorrow and pain from his mother dying. He takes the apple of life. He's given it by Aslan. Aslan says, now you can take it and use it for your mother. So he takes it back, and his mother is cured, and he buries the apple core in the backyard, and it grows into a tree, which years later is cut down, and its wood is made into a wardrobe. Good. Okay, there, you've got it all. Okay. What is really fascinating about this is the autobiographical implications of this story. If the thesis is accepted that telling the story of Diggory is partly a way for Lewis to work out his own agony over his mother's sickness and death, then this is the conclusion he has reached. God knows what would have happened if his prayers for her life had been answered, and he must be trusted to have known why it was necessary for his mother to die when she did. Lewis's theology of providence and the compassion of God are not worked out in the atmosphere of an academic laboratory or classroom, but in the crucible of his own heart. Lewis weeps through this book. It is also the book that Douglas Gresham read when his mother Joy, Lewis's wife, died. And so you see this kind of repetition of healing that comes from dealing with this. But death is not the last battle. The last battle comes, and this is the end of Narnia. If The Magician's Nephew is the Genesis, then the last battle is the Revelation, the book of Revelation. It's the 7th and final volume of the Chronicles of Narnia. The structures of both books, however, deal with last things first and then first things. In The Magician's Nephew, you see the end of the world of Charn and the beginning of Narnia. In the last battle, you see the end of the old Narnia and the beginning of the new Narnia. So he brings all of these things together. In fact, Lewis plays with a lot of puns in this book, where he really gives us the atmosphere that these are the end times. The book begins with the classic line that gives it all away. It starts, "In the last days of Narnia." Okay, so you know the ending is coming. About 3 weeks later, the last of the kings of Narnia sat under the great oak. During the reign of Tyrion, the last king of Narnia. And then the last battle of Narnia began. In fact, when the children, Eustace and Polly, arrive, they have one of the great kind of pun lines in here too. They go, "This is really Narnia at last." Okay? They play with that kind of double meaning right there that finally they've gotten here, but they don't realize by saying at last we're here, this is the last of Narnia. Now the story begins with Shift the ape and Puzzle the donkey finding an old lion skin, kind of a retelling of Aesop's fable of the donkey and the lion skin. Shift thinks he can exploit it by getting Puzzle to put it on and pretend to be Aslan returning. And this pretense, of course, is the Antichrist, pretending this Antichrist coming in. Shift then speaks for Aslan, telling the Narnians to cut down the talking trees for lumber to be put into Aslan's treasury. Conflicts begin to arise between true and false Narnians. The latter conspire with the Calamarine religion that worships the pagan god Tash. Now, some critics think that Lewis is referring to Islam here and the kind of the violence and the jihads there. But it's more likely that he's even going back farther to the Persian kings and their cruelties. The Arab cruelties were something that was kind of historic and legendary in their literature. When Shift asserts that Aslan and Tash are one, Tirian, the prince, the last king, rises up to resist him, but he's captured and tied to a tree. Eustace and Jill arrive to rescue him and his noble friend Jewel, the unicorn. They also rescue a band of dwarfs because they have been misled by the false Aslan. But as they've been misled, they have doubt and they're cynical completely. Their faith in the real Aslan has been shattered. They have grown cynical and skeptical, and they refuse to help anyone, claiming that the dwarfs are for the dwarfs. We're going to take care of ourselves, let everyone else be damned. Only one dwarf, Pogan, is faithful to Tirian, Aslan, and Narnia.
That sounds like today.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
I know, the remnant that is there, very much so. The cynicism of everyone. Yeah. Once they've seen some bad religion, I think they close off all religion. And that is the danger of our culture, that you can just mock it and not realize, no, there's something good here, and there are shadows and artifices that replace it. Now, Tirian and his little force advance on a wooden stable, and this is one of the great moments of adventure in this whole thing, where the false Aslan is kept. Puzzle is in there, and they begin to kind of find this very cunning and mercenary cat named Ginger. You can see that Lewis had both dogs and cats. He preferred dogs. Dogs were humble. Cats were Pharisees. Cats wanted to be served. Cats were around like Pharisees, saying, Lord, I thank you that you have not made me like this dog. Okay? But of course, Lewis says you have to remember that cats at one time were worshipped as gods in Egypt, and they haven't forgotten it. Okay? They find all of these kind of characters coming together at the stable. And we begin to see death, and death is kind of brutal and raw and vivid in this story. And many are killed, sometimes by the dwarves who attack both sides. Tash now seems to reside and haunts the stable. When Shift is finally thrown into the stable, the monster god swallows the ape whole. As the battle continues, Eustace, Jill, and Pogan are thrown into the stable. And Tirian is left alone, the last man standing and fighting for his life. And he finally grabs the villain, Rishta Tarkin, the cruel leader of the Calamarins, and he drags him into the stable where he meets this horrible creature who snatches him up under his arm. All those who call upon Tash, a vulture-like monster, are given to him. They have offered burnt offerings to their gods, now they become blood offerings. But wonder of wonders, for Tirian, on the other side of the stable, also lies this kind of vast and beautiful land. Tirian finds not only Eustace and Jill when he enters, but Peter, Edmund, Lucy, Polly, Diggory, everybody is there. It's a reunion. Everyone except Susan. Susan is there because she no longer believes in Narnia, but had become interested in nothing but nylons, lipstick, and parties. This is Lewis's jab at the American GI who came over during the war and saw all of these young British girls and gave them nylons and lipstick and parties. And so he's saying basically you begin to lose faith when you deal with GIs. Okay. However, she was a jolly sight too keen on being grown up. But Lewis explained in a letter to a child who was really worried about Susan. He says, well, Susan, is she lost forever? Is she going to hell? And he explains, no, even though she's no longer a friend of Narnia now, this doesn't need to be permanent. She may merely be in a place of false sophistication in the same way that I was during my teen years. And so it's a moment of grace even for Susan that he explains outside of the text. Then Aslan comes through the stable door and holds his last judgment over all the animals and people, including those who had previously died, when they're gathered outside the barn and judged by Aslan. Those who had been loyal to Aslan or whose hearts had sought what was good and right and true join Aslan in entering his country. Those who had opposed him or deserted him become ordinary animals and vanish to an unmentioned place. Aslan then fulfills the apocalyptic prophecies of the New Testament, destroying Narnia by water and fire and closing the stable door forever. Dragons appear to eat Narnian vegetation, and Father Time comes down and the stars fall into the sea, and the moon is swallowed by the dying sun, a dull reddish light which hangs over the black blue sky. And so you see in the Gospel of Matthew, all of these signs Lewis has kind of incorporated to the end times here. There are earthquakes and everything else, and it's what Lewis called kind of the twilight of the gods. Now, the characters spend a lot of time discussing death. And they go, and Mouse says to Tyrion, it would be better if we all died before this began. Ruin with the Centaur reminds everyone that a noble death is good. Even Eustace and Jill discuss their possible deaths. But the means of death is the stable door. And notice Lewis's creativity in this. How did God enter this world but through a stable door? And now the door is the same way out that was in. Death is the new way into Aslan's country. You have to go where the baby Jesus was. The stable door is a metaphor for death. The stable of Bethlehem in Chesterton's Everlasting Man, that God came to us in a cave, and now the Narnians are taken to Aslan through a cave stable. The stable seen from within and without, though, are two different places. On one side of the door, death is seen as terrifying, black, unknown, something that just worries you and creates anxiety. But on the other side, Lewis paints death in the glory of Aslan's country. Now, judgment is very interesting here, and we get a hint of what Lewis thinks about the last judgment. The dwarves are for the dwarves, and they're not going to be taken in, so they remain blind. They remain in the darkness. But judgment occurs when you look into Aslan's face. And here, when this is the kind of the final judgment for everyone. In fact, you have one Calamarine pagan whose name is Emeth. And Emeth in Hebrew means truth or faithfulness. Even though he was a servant of a false god, in his heart he was really seeking Aslan. And all he knew, the only revelation he had, was this false god. And he thought, this must be the way to God. And so Lewis allows his heart, which is good, to finally see Aslan and say, basically, you are what I was looking for. All my life I have been seeking you, but I've been stuck. I've never been preached the gospel to. And so we have him entering heaven there too. Then everyone discovers the new Narnia. And they discover on the way to the new Narnia, they're just kind of excited. They're running so fast. They have this energy of youth just running up there. And as they're running, they come upon fruit trees where they stop to taste and enjoy. Now notice this is the first time today we've talked about food. Okay? He says, no one could describe the taste. All I can say is that compared to these fruits, the freshest grapefruit you've ever eaten was dull. The juiciest orange was dry. And the most melting pear was hard and woody. And the sweetest wild strawberry was sour. And once you had eaten that fruit, all the nicest things in this world would taste like medicine after them. And so they run up and they come past the new Shadowlands to a call that is further up and further in. This is the one phrase you need to take with you, further up and further in. In the British language, it's farther up and farther in, a kind of a pun on the Father, coming to the Father, coming closer to the Father God. But here, we kind of play and we move further up and further in into what is real life. This is where the unicorn sums it up and says, I have come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land I've been looking for all my life, though I never knew it. The reason why we love the old Narnia is that it sometimes looks a little like this. And so they come in. And then they begin to sing, and they begin to dance. They begin to kind of enjoy each other, and they find Prince Caspian, Puddleglum, Trumpkin, Tumnus the Fawn, all the old friends. It is like a wedding celebration, a feast. And there was greeting and kissing and handshaking. Old jokes were brought out. You have no idea how good an old joke sounds when you take it out after 500 or 600 years. And they all move forward to the center of the orchard, moving up into the new Narnia. And the series ends with the revelation that it was only the beginning of the true story, which goes on forever and in which every chapter is better than the one before. Grace at the beginning, grace at the end, and grace all the way through. In our lives, we can look back and see how grace brought us into the kingdom. We can look to the end of our lives and know that grace is going to save us. But sometimes we forget that it is also grace all the way through. Every moment is a taste of grace. And that new Narnia is waiting for us. Thank you.